have a secret sketchbook and it's called the Ugly Duckling Sketchbook. Except I don't think it's ever going to be a swan. But before I show you this extremely embarrassing sketchbook, let's get to the point of this video. Hello and welcome. I'm Diane and I like to go for walks and record what I see in my sketchbook. But I feel there's something missing from my sketchbook, and that is people. I've been looking at old sketchbooks recently, and I found a challenge in the Ugly Duckling sketchbook that I'd set myself a couple of years ago. It was to draw a self-portrait every day for 30 days and see if it led to any improvement in my people drawing skills. But this also brought up some questions. Do challenges that span several days actually work, or do I need to tackle this from a different angle? Here's another one of my sketchbooks, and I named this sketchbook The Rambling Robin because I sketched in it every day and I could sketch whatever I wanted. But let's see if I can improve on this now. I want to take a scene of a walk that I did, but include myself in it as a self-portrait. I'm going to use a book to help me, and this book I got second hand. So it was published quite a long time ago, but I liked the idea of adding figures to landscapes because it gives a sense of perspective and proportion, and I think that can be something that's missing from my nature journal at the moment. So my idea is to include myself as a figure in the corner that's drawing the scene. I used this book as inspiration and created my own version of the scene. I really struggled with this challenge, but I think I came up with something that was okay in the end. So let's get back to the Ugly Duckling sketchbook. And yes, I do give my sketchbook names because I have several on the go at the same time. First of all, let's go through some of the rules that I gave myself for this sketchbook, and I wrote them on the first page. So the rules are: no ripping out pages, no painting over drawings, however terrible they may seem, keep drawings as a record of your progress, don't stay stuck on one drawing, draw a line under it and move on. I've avoided it for this far in the video. Are we ready to look at day one of this self-imposed challenge? Oh dear. But let's not judge. Let's just move on to the rest of them. I tend not to show myself in my videos, and rest assured I don't actually look like this. In fact, I am wondering if I've got 30 different split personalities because each portrait looks completely different. In fact, I think I've got worse as it went along. I must have been in a bad mood on some of these days. The other rule that I gave myself was to write down how I was feeling at the time. I wanted to see if my mood affected the drawing. You'll see some notes scribbled at the side. I would create the self-portrait, say how I was feeling, and then look at it again and analyse what I could do differently. I think the reason I've not included people in my sketchbook is because I find them difficult to draw. I'd rather focus on drawing something that I'm good at to stay in my comfort zone. But this video isn't about staying in comfort zones. In fact, showing my secret sketchbook does feel very uncomfortable, but I think it's worth doing just to prove a point. And I know that I'm showing you my secret sketchbook here, but the point is, we don't need to show our sketchbooks. We can have ones that are private, where we experiment. And because there's no one judging us, The experiments can be whatever you like, even though the end result may be highly amusing. But looking back on it now, it's really interesting to see how some days are better than others. Although there's limited improvement, there does seem to be a little bit of improvement at the end. The sketches seem to go from okay to not very good to okay to awful to okay. So it seems to suggest that progress isn't a straight line. For the last 2 days of the challenge, I decided not to draw myself at all, and I ended up with this robin. If you've seen any of my other videos, you'll know that I've got another journal. It's my posh final sketchbook where I try and create more polished or finished spreads. And as part of this challenge, I'm going to create a layout based on my earlier sketchbook, but with people added to it. So first of all, I'm going to sketch a layout. I like to use this cheap sketching artist pad, just to practice what I'm going to do before I do anything in my other journal. So for this layout, I want to go over 2 pages in my journal, and I want certain elements to cross over the 2 pages. So at the top, I'm going to have a landscape. Next to the landscape, I thought it'd be quite nice to have a map of the walk. And then around the landscape, I want to do some nature studies of some of the plants and butterflies that I saw on the day. This is a scene from May in the UK. So I'm creating a landscape and nature studies that are typical of this area. I'm going to have the title of the page underneath. And I'm going to have a self-portrait on the right. And at the top, I'm going to have some text. So now that I've decided on my layout, it makes it a bit easier to sketch it out. Here I'm sketching out the layout in my big sketchbook. And this will be a guide for where to place the paintings. I create the landscape first using watercolours and gouache. I've put a list of materials in the description. I build layers and vibrancy with watercolours and add gouache on top for the dots of flowers. I'm not going to make this scene hyper-realistic. I just wanted to look more of like a postcard of the scene. I use watercolour and build it up in layers. It did look very washed out, so I decided to use a darker green. I wanted to record highlights of some of the flowers and butterflies. Near the landscape, I paint these orange tip butterflies. And these butterflies like cuckoo flowers, as they're called, and I'm going to paint these next to it. They both appear at this time of year in this type of landscape. I'm painting the male orange tip butterfly, and then next to it I'm painting the female. I love these butterflies, they're so vibrant. As well as having the orange tips, they have a tiny dot on each wing, and I think these markings are very distinctive. I really enjoyed painting the butterfly because I find it a bit easier to do. This is the cuckoo flower, but I did make a mistake on the shape of the flower because I was painting it from memory, and when I looked back on my reference photo, I'd realised that I'd put pointed petals on the shape of the flower and they don't actually look like that. But I did correct this later on. In fact, I did a lot of corrections of this scene later on. My earlier rule of not painting over things didn't seem to go out the window. I painted this with watercolours and gouache, which I find a much easier combination because the watercolours are beautiful because you can build up layers and it is a very delicate way of painting. But if you want to go over something, you just can't. I found ways of painting over the top and making it look how I want it to look in the end. These are the female orange tip butterflies, and I'm painting them with their wings folded up so that you can see underneath. They have this lovely pattern underneath that camouflages them a bit. And this leaf that I'm painting in the background is made up because I wanted a darker background so that they show up a bit more. And I think there are leaves that are this shape, but I decided in the end to go for a scene that looks pretty rather than accurate. Just don't tell anyone. And here I'm going over the petals of the cuckoo flower to make them slightly more rounded. On the left-hand side, I create this map. I transfer it from a sketch using tracing paper and trace down paper. I outline with black fine liner and use watercolour and gouache to add colour. The dashed line in the middle of the map is meant to show the path that we took through all these lakes. And the painting I did in the middle of the two spreads is a scene from one of the lakes. I leave it all to dry before adding on labels with a fine liner pen. And this is the map finished before I redid the cuckoo flower. I want to share with you what I learnt from Margaret Evans' book, the one I mentioned earlier, Painting Figures and Animals. And the most important thing I think I learnt was simplification. There are a couple of pages in her book that shows how she simplifies the figure, so I thought I'd give this a go. Human figures do look incredibly complicated to draw, but when you draw them as a stick figure, as Margaret recommends, it makes it a lot easier. She suggests drawing a line, dividing it in half, dividing that in half again, and then half again. That is the proportion of the head to the body. So the head is about 1/8 of the size of the body, and then she recommends drawing these two triangles with the feet at the bottom. And from that you can kind of get the shape of the human, or should I say a woman wearing a skirt. I know that I did it a bit too extreme here, but you get the idea of the proportions of the body. And I found this really helpful. One of the things I struggle with is the proportions. And the other thing the author suggests is to draw a line in a shape of the direction that the person is moving in. So you would draw a curved line for someone who's leaning forward, and the head would be 1/8. The torso, the rest of it up to the halfway line, and then the rest of it would be the legs. And this is something I don't get quite right as well, is I always make the arms too short when actually they are a bit longer. And here I've made the figure into someone walking with a stick, and they're leaning over. You can do this for a group of people or people different sizes. So here you've got an adult with a child. So the adult is the same proportions, but they're just taller. I find this a really fun way to draw people. The author actually suggests that you create a whole sketchbook full of these figures that you can add on to landscape scenes or any other scene, and it can be like a reference book. So the other thing from this book, and she does go through a lot more than this, but the other thing I learnt from this book is about geometric shapes and making the human body out of shapes. And this really helped me as well. So you've got a circle for the head and the torso, and then like a triangle for the shoulders with the arms coming out of it. I think I may have made the arms a bit long here. And for the rest of the body, it's another circle and more sausage shapes for the legs and circles for the knees. And at the bottom, 2 triangles for feet. And I know this is a very crude drawing, but this helps me understand how to create a figure. I know these aren't great drawings, but I find this a great way to start. And it really helped me to start to draw figures. I have done figures in my sketches and my journals, but they tend to be few and far between. It'd be nice to have a whole sketchbook full of them. I like to do nature studies, but sometimes it's quite nice to have something a bit different to draw. And here again, I wasn't sure about the length of the arms. They go below the waist, but I'm either making it too short or too long. I suppose the other thing is not to overthink things and just try and rough things out. I can't help myself, I keep correcting myself, but I think you get the general idea. And these tips are what I use to create a figure of myself in the corner of the layout. So I'm using a figure from the book as inspiration, but I'm not copying it directly, I'm just copying the shapes. I think the thing I need to remember the most is simplification, just simplifying the figure to shapes so that it doesn't seem so daunting to draw. In the end, I referred to a photograph of myself rather than trying to draw from memory, because the other thing I've noticed is I make better drawings when I'm actually drawing from observation rather than trying to remember something. This was my first drawing, but I modified it to make it look a bit more like me, and I transferred it to my journal with the tracing paper and the trace down paper. The other recommendation from the book was to just add blocks of colour. So I wear this pink hat, so I added pink for the hat and just blocked in all the colours of the figure separately. I did struggle with the shape of the shoulders, and this is something that I corrected in the end because it didn't look quite right. But I more or less left the rest of it as it was sketched in here. I also painted myself on a bench rather than a chair. And the other thing that I did, and I don't know why I did this, I painted myself left-handed when I'm actually right-handed. But no one's going to notice that, are they? I have to say I wasn't entirely happy with this figure, but one of the rules of this particular sketchbook is to finish the page, no abandoning any paintings. And I think that's a great rule to have, because it makes you think about what you don't like about the painting and what you do like, and to learn from it. I don't think this is the best spread in this sketchbook, but that's not always going to happen, is it? There are some spreads that you think I could do better and improve, and I'm glad I challenged myself to paint a figure. This is something that I use to go over things when I want to repaint it, and it's called watercolour ground, and you can paint it over the top of watercolours. I think it's meant to be a type of primer, but I use it to paint over the top so that I can repaint something. It's a bit of a cheat, really, but I was really unhappy with this butterfly that I'd painted, and I'd actually smudged some paint. So this area here, I wanted to add the lettering for the heading. You can still see some of the original layer underneath, but that didn't really bother me, as long as the lettering was clear. And I painted this in using black watercolour. I'm altering the shape of the torso here because it doesn't look quite right. The shoulders look too far up on one side and too far down on the other. I found this watercolour ground really useful just to go over the top and turn it into a different shape. I think in the end, it does look a bit better. But I think I've still got a long way to go in terms of drawing figures. And in the future, I think I shall just add them as stick figures in the background. I found this a real challenge to paint this figure. The other issue I realised about this painting was the tonal values weren't quite correct. Because I remember the sun was shining on my back, so the light would fall along my back and along my sleeve. I looked at the image from the book. I noticed that the shadows were quite distinct, and that really helped to create the form of the figure. So I added in lighter areas and darker areas, and I think this made a difference. I then added text at the top. But there's still one thing missing, and that is the scene looks a bit empty. So I added a figure looking out to the lake, and I think this gives the scene a bit more of a story of someone looking out to the lake, relaxing and enjoying the scene. And this is how I'd like to use figures in my paintings in the future. I am still going to record nature and nature studies, but it is an element I'd like to add just for fun. And now it's time for the final results. I'm going to try and summarise everything I've learnt from doing this process. I think my initial self-imposed 30-day challenge that I did 2 years ago didn't really have a goal except to get me to try and draw people. I didn't improve because there was no guidance or tuition that I was following. Nature journals are about recording nature, but I also feel like they can be whatever you want them to be. I'm still trying to find my style, and I'm looking at other artists for inspiration, but I'm thinking that maybe adding the stick figures could be part of my way of interpreting nature. Let me know your thoughts on this.